And the Russians are, I mean, I said it in one of my speeches in the parliament last week, right? If the Russians drop bombs on a city or town in Ukraine, right, that terrorizes the people in that village, right? And that is a form of terrorism. But as I pointed out to them, they had, how come we didn't care about the hundreds of thousands that were killed in Afghanistan? And a UN report showed that of all the aerial bombardment by US and NATO in the 20 years in Afghanistan, a UN report now, right? Not exactly a left-wing body. They said that of all the aerial bombardments that hit civilians, 45% of the victims were children. The US killed over 1 million people in Iraq, citizens, over 1 million people. We didn't give a damn about them. We wouldn't even give them shelter as refugees. The UN report in December last year said that almost 400,000 were dead in December last year in Yemen, and 15.8 million were starving. And we didn't give a damn about them. What in God's name is wrong with us? We say we care about the Ukrainians. Well, do we care about them enough to stop them from dying? I don't think so. Because we're not stopping them from dying. As long as we keep pumping more and more arms into it, we're throwing diesel on a fire.
Welcome, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and I'm very happy to talk today to nobody less than Mick Wallace, the brave and outspoken teammate of Clare Daly in the EU Parliament, where he's a part of the political group The Left. Like Clare, he served 2 terms in the Irish Parliament before moving to the EU level in 2019. He stands in a very long tradition of outspoken Irishmen in national and foreign policy. To quote from his own homepage, Mr. Wallace has lived many lives: a builder, a neutrality campaigner, a non-conformist, a wine producer, a wine bar owner, a football coach and manager, and football manager, and an advocate for whistleblowers. And of course, he's a politician too. Mick Wallace, thank you so much for coming online tonight.
No problem.
So let me start by saying that it doesn't happen very often anymore these days that a politician in Europe would put the word neutrality up front in his political profile. Can you tell me what neutrality means to you, why you stand up for it, and how is that working out for you on the EU level?
Well, I suppose our neutrality is very much something that's probably had its roots in Ireland, obviously. We're a small island, and we have no good reason to be taking sides in imperial battles between the various powers of the world. We don't believe in war. We think it's stupid, and we think peace is a much better alternative. And during the Second World War, Ireland had a president called Eamon de Valera, and he didn't take sides in the Second World War. Now, you could question why he actually didn't take sides. It was obviously partially to do with the fact that Northern Ireland, the 6 counties of Northern Ireland, were still under British rule and remain so today. So there was a lot of animosity towards the British from a political point of view. And obviously he wasn't going to take sides with the Germans, even though they were fighting with the British. We stayed out of the war, and it meant that we weren't involved with either side, and that made a lot of sense to us. But it doesn't make sense for us to be getting involved in imperialist wars anyway. Ireland, unfortunately, has too close a relationship with the Americans today, and we do allow Shannon to be used by the US military as a base to move on to further areas to cause havoc and destruction in predominantly Muslim countries. But we have opposed that. Sadly, our governments haven't, but the majority of the people of Ireland are very fond of the idea of neutrality. And In the latest war in Europe now, with Russia invading Ukraine, and has obviously exercised the whole of Europe dramatically. Um, a lot of countries around the world, in fact, over half the world's population come from countries that refuse to take sides in the war. They stayed neutral. They didn't take Russia's side. They didn't take Ukraine and NATO, US side. They stayed neutral. And it's obviously very disappointing that the EU have condemned from a height anyone that dared to stay neutral. But that's the space that we're in today. And it's obviously it doesn't make sense to us. Anyone that stays neutral should be free to do so. And for Europe to condemn those who stayed neutral is irrational from our perspective.
Where's that irrationality coming from? I mean, the EU used to pride itself to be a force for peace, and now in the current war, they are like very, very much pushing weapons and weapons and weapons and weapons. And I've talked about this with Claire, and I just don't understand why voices for against escalation and against weapon deliveries are like so few and far between, like yours and Claire's, who are very outspoken in the EU Parliament. Why is there not more coming from the EU in terms of diplomacy?
Well, I mean, traditionally the EU would have prided itself on the whole area of diplomacy and dialogue and the need to establish peace wherever possible. But unfortunately, this time the European Union is actually promoting war, and many of the politicians across Europe have bought into this. Now, I mean, look, it's not black and white. Mainstream media is loving the war. Sadly, an awful lot of politicians seem to be loving the war and trying to make a name for themselves by being gung-ho and advocating for fueling the war further and further and escalating it by pumping more and more arms into Ukraine. The more arms that they put into Ukraine, the higher the shares will go in the arms industry, but also the more Ukrainians will die. And this is actually total madness, and it's getting more dangerous. The war is escalating. Russia isn't going to be backing down anytime soon. The West are giving more dangerous, lethal weapons all the time to Ukraine to make sure the war doesn't stop. And don't forget that Boris Johnson went twice to Kiev on behalf of NATO and the Americans to make sure that Kiev didn't reach a negotiated settlement with the Russians to stop the war. The US and NATO don't want the war to stop. And sadly, in Europe today, we don't have leaders prepared to stand up to the US and NATO. We have incredibly weak leadership at the moment in Europe, and it's never been so obvious, and that's been a real problem. I still think that if Merkel had been in power in Germany still, I think there was less chance of the war starting. There was ample opportunities to make sure the war didn't start in the several months leading up to the war. There was opportunities after the war started to introduce the notion of dialogue and diplomacy, but Europe didn't go to that space. We are behaving like a vassal of US empire, and that's very sad today.
How can that be changed? Do you see a way forward for European EU politicians in the current constellation to actually somehow de-escalate the situation? And just to remind us all, we just now have 2 blown up pipelines between Russia and Germany, and still the whole world seems to be wondering who did it. What's your take on that, and how do you think it could be de-escalated at this point?
Listen, there is always the potential for peace talks. And I think it's important for people. I mean, you ask, well, how can this change? Well, first of all, people should understand that the majority of the people of Europe are in favor of peace, and they're not in favor of war. They are not in favor of escalating the conflict. And there was a survey done by, uh, it's actually a EU body. It's called European Council Foreign Relations Department, and they do surveys across Europe. And they did a survey in late June, I think it was, and the main question was, would you favor punishing Russia or looking for peace? And over 2/3 of the people across Europe voted for peace, not for continuing to punish Russia, because that's what the European Union, at the behest of the Americans, are looking to do. They want to destroy the Russian economy, and funneling arms and escalating the conflict is part of this ambition to undermine Russia. Uh, it's crazy that the Europeans have bought into it so much, because we're actually suffering dramatically from it ourselves. We have huge cost of living rises in the last number of months. We've huge inflation, huge increase in energy prices, and it's causing serious instability, not just in Eastern Europe, but it's spreading right across Europe. But the citizens are not on the same page as the politicians. The politicians are behaving like they were being paid by the US or NATO. And the media, the mainstream media, are behaving like they're being paid by the likes of National Endowment for Democracy. I don't know who National Endowment for Democracy are giving their money to, but they do boast that they fund independent media across in all countries of the world. And their notion of independent in ours is very different, because really they're funding media looking for support for US imperialism to continue and US hegemony to prevail. But the people are in a different space. You mentioned Nord Stream 2. I am absolutely shocked that there's been so little talk about Nord Stream 2 in the European Parliament. I find it really interesting. Why aren't they wanting a proper independent investigation? Why are they gone so silent about it? If they were convinced that the Russians did it, now the Russians would have wanted to be out of their heads to blow up their own pipeline, and given that they can just turn the tap off on their end. But listen, the world wants to know who did this. This is a criminal act, and whether whoever did it should pay a serious price. And the biggest damage was done environmentally. This was one of the largest emission of methane in the history of mankind. This was unbelievable environmental disaster. Who did it? Why aren't we trying to find out more who did it? We want to know. And whether it's the Russians or the Americans or whoever it was, right, they need to be held to account. But my God, I am shocked. There's been so little talk about it in the European Union. Now, one MEP, and Sikorski from Poland, he did a tweet and it got a lot of coverage, and he thanked the Americans for blowing it up. Now, Sikorski would have a closer relationship with the Pentagon than any a stronger tie, I would say, than any other MEP. But he thanked the Americans for doing it. It was up for a few days and then he took it down. But I think it's really important that we find out who did it. And it's shocking that there doesn't seem to be much of an appetite in the European Union for finding out who did it.
At this point, I really wonder how much more we will be asked to believe in terms of how suicidal Russia is. We are asked to believe that Russia attacks its own pipeline. We're asked to believe that Russia attacks a nuclear power plant it controls, and we are asked to believe that Russia attacks a prison where it houses prisoners of war from the other side. There is a lot of these things that I just can't believe them anymore, even if I tried to. But this goes hand in hand with the role of the media, and also something that US former ambassador Chas Freeman said, which is that the current era of Russophobia and being afraid also of China is actually worse than what he experienced at the very beginning of his tenure or of his youth during the McCarthyism. He says there's an absolute kind of like a war mentality against enemies going on. Do you feel something similar in the European Union of war mentality over a continent that
well,
officially says we're not at war?
Yeah, look at support for US imperialism for years has been always there in Europe, but yet at the same time, it would, generally speaking, Europe looked after its own priorities as well. I mean, for example, Merkel was probably the best example. Merkel had a good relationship with the Americans, but she didn't let him push her around. She wasn't pushed around by them. They wanted to stop Nord Stream 2 a long time ago, when Merkel says, no, we need this. This is in Germany's interest. We want it. But that's gone now. I haven't seen such a collapse of dissent among politicians in my lifetime as I'm witnessing at the moment across Europe, in the member states and in the European Union. And it's pretty shocking. Now, you mentioned the mainstream media, and the mainstream media have played a crucial role. And gradually, over a number of years, more and more of the mainstream media was coming under the orbit of the American agenda. And I think that has never been so obvious. And it's very worrying. If somebody buys the media and they control the narrative, they don't just tell the news anymore, they actually shape it and make it to their own liking rather than report it. You pointed out the 3 cases of Russia attacking a prison where they had their own prisoners attacking, where they were holding guys of themselves. The nuclear plant that they were in control of. I mean, why would you attack a nuclear plant that you were occupying and controlling? And likewise with Nord Stream 2. Look, in war, everybody tells lies, right? And as far as I'm concerned, the Russians tell lies, the Ukrainians tell lies, the Americans tell lies, the Europeans tell lies when it all suits them. Governments leave a lot to be desired anyway, but the manner in which politicians have bowed the knee and fallen in line and accepted the mainstream US narrative, NATO narrative, leaves a lot to be desired, and it's worrying. And I want to stress again, though, that the people of Europe are in a different place. While they would have bought into a lot of the nonsense being put out by the mainstream media in the early days, and you must remember as well, people are at home in the different member states, they're looking at videos of terrible things happening in Ukraine. And terrible things are happening in Ukraine. And the Russians are, I said it in one of my speeches in the parliament last week, right? If the Russians drop bombs on a city or town in Ukraine, right, that terrorizes the people in that village, right? And that is a form of terrorism. But as I pointed out to them, how come we didn't care about the hundreds of thousands that were killed in Afghanistan? And a UN report showed that of all the aerial bombardment by US and NATO in the 20 years in Afghanistan, a UN report now, right? Not exactly a left-wing body. They said that of all the aerial bombardments that hit civilians, 45% of the victims were children. The US killed over 1 million people in Iraq, citizens, over 1 million people. We didn't give a damn about them. We wouldn't even give them shelter as refugees. The UN report in December last year said that almost 400,000 were dead in December last year in Yemen, and 15.8 million were starving. And we didn't give a damn about them. What in God's name is wrong with us? We say we care about the Ukrainians. Well, do we care about them enough to stop them from dying? I don't think so. because we're not stopping them from dying. As long as we keep pumping more and more arms into it, we're throwing diesel on a fire. We're throwing diesel on a fire. We're inflaming the conflict, and we're causing more Ukrainians to die. And listen, don't ever forget, who dies in war? It's the vulnerable, women, children, and the old people. And the poor people die fighting, because the rich people don't fight in the wars. The poor people fight in the wars. There's poor Ukrainians dying now for a US NATO proxy war with the 100% support of a leaderless Europe. And it is just too bad for words.
And every time I say something like that, I immediately get, but Hitler attacked, but Hitler was evil, and we had to stand up to Hitler, right?
Listen, anyone that invades another country is breaking the law, and it's an evil thing to do, and it's a form of terrorism. But how come the invasion of Ukraine is the only invasion that we've cared about since the Second World War? There was millions killed in Vietnam, millions killed in Korea. We didn't give a damn about them. The amount of people killed in Central America, so the Americans can control the land and the financial resources of the area. How come we didn't care about them?
And the people dying in Palestine.
We're imposing sanctions on countries like Syria and Iran and Venezuela. Who are the sanctions hitting? Sanctions kill the less well off. They kill the most vulnerable. And we're introducing sanctions now, following the pattern of the Americans. We're killing people with sanctions. We're killing people in Iran with sanctions, and Syria. And there was 40,000 died in a 2-year period in Venezuela. I think it was 2019 to 21. 40,000 people died because of the sanctions. What's that? Is that terrorism? Is that murder? What is it like? I mean, what's wrong with us? Hitler. Who's defending Hitler? I mean, the Russians actually defeated Hitler, and they lost 26 million people in the process, right? Yes. The Russians were the main reason that the Nazis lost.
Yes.
But yet here we are today. We're funneling arms into Ukraine, and it doesn't seem to bother us that there's a strong Nazi element with the Azovs, and they're probably the strongest element in the Ukraine army today. We're pumping guns into Ukraine today that are getting into the hands of Nazis, and we're not afraid of Nazism anymore, because we should be.
Two more questions. A, how to bring that message across to more people, to or is it already enough people? Am I just not seeing them, like, from looking at mass media? And secondly, I'm editing a chapter right now on Frank Eichen and his impact on creating the non-proliferation treaty, how important it was to have neutral countries that would help shape non-proliferation in the late 50s and early 60s. Do you see any chance for neutral forces to come back and help us to get to de-escalation and new arms control?
Yes, listen, I'm an optimist, and while things look bleak at the moment, I'm not without hope. You asked first about just, are you missing it? Are you not seeing it? How many people actually can see through what's going on at the moment in relation to the war? And I had started to make a point, and I didn't finish it, about the fact that people are sitting at home on their televisions, watching their television in the evening after work, and they're actually looking at a one-sided version of the war. So we see the Russians doing terrible things in Ukraine, and they are doing terrible things in Ukraine. But Ukraine are doing terrible things as well. And they killed 14,000 of their own people in the Donbass before the war even started. But let's not even go to that space, right? The point is that if you're going to feed people one version of a war, then if the people don't have the wherewithal or the means to actually look beyond that propaganda, then you're going to have an awful lot of people believing what the mainstream media and what their television set is telling them. And we do have a lot of that. But yet at the same time, despite all of that, and despite the one-sided narrative, when they did the survey, over 2/3 of the people said they wanted peace. Because even if the Russians are doing terrible things, well, peace still makes sense. Peace always makes sense. And you would say, well, okay, right, where's the hope for the future? Are we going to? Can we have, uh, you know, bodies and countries taking a neutral position and fighting to their wits' end to establish peace again? Yes, and Ireland could be one of those. We could be. There's great strength in being neutral. Amazing strength in being neutral, where you don't actually belong to anybody and you're
I
independent.
agree.
That's why we're independent. We're independent politicians in the parliament. We're like Groucho Marx. We wouldn't have anything to do with any party that would even have us as a member, right? It's really important for us to be independent. We can speak and think for ourselves. We're taking instructions from nobody, not from the Americans, not from the Brussels, not from Russia, not from the Chinese. Nobody's telling us what to do. We're saying what we think is right. We're fighting for peace. We're fighting against war. We're pacifists, right? And we do that as long as we're alive, right? And there's a lot of people who feel the same as us, right? But we do need to empower them. People need to go on the streets. Politicians never change the world. People do. The people have to change the politicians, because the politicians are basically conservative animals looking after themselves. The politics leaves an awful lot to be desired. An awful lot of people in politics are disappointed and don't expect too much from them. Look to your civic leaders. Look to your small groups in your own community. We need to organize ourselves in a peaceful way to change the narrative and work for peace and oppose war, morning, noon, and night. And
I
this is my final comment on that. I love a comment that I love relaying. Right, about 20 years ago, Noam Chomsky was giving a talk. I was in a hall somewhere in America, right, and this guy went up to at the end, or maybe from the floor, asked him a question and just said to him, Mr. Chomsky, listen, you're a great man and you're doing great things and it's great and all right. But listen, the powers and forces against you are so great. The whole US government at the time was totally had been conquered by the military industrial complex. And sadly, the European Union is going down the same path now. And he says, the fellow said to him, Mr. Chomsky, how can you change things? Do you not think it's impossible? You keep saying that we can make the world better. I said, but how do you do it? Is it not an impossible struggle? And Chomsky says, every human being on earth, he says, every single person has the capacity to make the world a better place each day. Every single person in the world, he says, can help to make the world a better place each day. And sometimes, he says, it only takes a smile.
Thank you, Mr. Wallace. I support you and I support the cause you're standing for and the pacifist convictions that you're showing. And I know from the comments that I read that a lot of people do support exactly that. So please continue, please carry on, and let's smile at those who don't. Thank you very much for taking the time, and see you next time.
No problem. No problem.